Daniel Carter had always believed that love was measured not in words, but in sacrifices. For most of his life, he had been the kind of man people rarely noticed. Quiet, humble, the sort of person who sat at the back of a room and listened more than he spoke. If you asked the neighbors about him, they would simply say he was a hard-working man who kept to himself. But those who truly knew Daniel understood something deeper about him. He was a father first, and everything else second. From the moment his daughter Emily was born, Daniel made a silent promise to himself. No matter how difficult life became, he would make sure she never felt the weight of his struggles. She would grow up believing the world was full of kindness, opportunity, and beauty. And for years, he worked tirelessly to keep that promise. When Emily was 5 years old, Daniel started waking up before sunrise. He would quietly drink his coffee in the dim kitchen light, careful not to wake his daughter before leaving for work. Some days he didn't return home until long after Emily had fallen asleep, but every morning before he left, he would peek into her room. She would be curled up in her small bed, hugging her favorite stuffed rabbit. Daniel would stand in the doorway for a moment, smiling softly. Everything he did was for that little girl. As Emily grew older, Daniel became her biggest supporter. He attended every school event, every recital, every parent meeting. He never missed a single birthday or milestone. Even when he was exhausted, he showed up. Emily adored her father. To her, Daniel wasn't just a parent, he was her hero. The man who fixed her broken toys, helped her with math homework, and made the best pancakes every Sunday morning. But as the years passed, life slowly changed. Emily grew up, went to college, and began building her own future. Daniel watched proudly as she became a confident, intelligent young woman. Seeing her succeed was the greatest reward he could have ever imagined. Then one evening, Emily came home with someone new. His name was Ryan. Ryan was charming, confident, and well-dressed. He came from a wealthy and well-known family in the city. His parents owned several businesses, and their name carried influence in many circles. When Daniel first met him, he shook Ryan's hand firmly and welcomed him into his home. He wanted to believe Ryan loved Emily as deeply as she deserved. And Emily looked happy. That was all that mattered to him. However, Daniel quickly noticed something else. Whenever Ryan's family visited, their smiles were polite, but their eyes held a quiet judgment. They looked around Daniel's modest home as if they were visiting a place far beneath them. They spoke about luxury vacations, expensive properties, and elite social events. Daniel rarely joined those conversations. Instead, he sat quietly and listened. He had spent most of his life avoiding attention. Wealth had never impressed him, and he had never felt the need to prove himself to anyone. But Ryan's family seemed to assume that Daniel was simply a struggling, ordinary man. They never asked questions about his past. They never wondered how he had managed to send Emily to a prestigious university without loans. They never questioned why he always seemed calm, even when they subtly looked down on him. Daniel let them believe whatever they wanted because he knew the truth about himself, and he had never needed anyone's approval. Months later, Ryan proposed to Emily. When she rushed into Daniel's house with tears of joy and a sparkling ring on her finger, Daniel hugged her tightly. "I said yes, Dad," she whispered. Daniel smiled warmly. "If you're happy, sweetheart, then I'm happy." The wedding planning began soon after. Ryan's family immediately took control of the discussions. They spoke about grand venues, luxurious decorations, expensive catering, and hundreds of guests. Everything had to be perfect. Daniel listened quietly as they described their vision for a magnificent wedding. It would be held in the largest ballroom in the city, with elegant lighting, live music, and a guest list of nearly 300 people. The cost would be enormous, but Daniel never once complained. In fact, without telling anyone, including Emily, he began making phone calls. Within weeks, deposits were quietly paid, the venue was secured, the decorators were hired, the caterers received their payments. Even the honeymoon arrangements were completed. Each vendor was given the same simple instruction: Please keep my name private," Daniel said gently. He didn't want credit. He didn't want praise. He only wanted one thing, for Emily to have the most beautiful wedding day of her life. As the wedding day approached, excitement filled the air. Guests traveled from different cities. The ballroom was transformed into something breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above tables covered in elegant white linens and delicate flowers. Music filled the room as people laughed, talked, and celebrated. Nearly 300 guests gathered to witness the union of Emily and Ryan, and among them, sitting quietly at a small table near the back of the hall, was Daniel Carter. He wore a simple black suit and watched proudly as his daughter walked down the aisle in a stunning white dress. Tears formed in his eyes as he saw her smile. In that moment, every sacrifice he had made felt worth it. All the early mornings, all the long nights, every challenge, everything had led to this moment, but as Daniel looked around the room, he noticed something troubling. Ryan's relatives were whispering among themselves. Some glanced toward Daniel with amused expressions, as if they found his quiet presence oddly out of place at such an extravagant event. A few of them even laughed softly. Daniel noticed, but he simply smiled. He had learned long ago that dignity didn't come from proving people wrong. It came from knowing who you were and staying calm when others misunderstood you. Across the room, Ryan stood confidently among his friends, laughing loudly as he prepared for the next part of the celebration. Soon, he would give his wedding speech. Daniel lifted his glass and took a slow sip of water, unaware that within the next few minutes, the young man he had welcomed into his family would stand in front of 300 guests and attempt to humiliate him in a way no father ever expected. But Daniel didn't look worried. He simply watched his daughter dance under the glowing lights. Because deep down, he knew something Ryan didn't. Some truths have a way of revealing themselves at exactly the right moment. The music softened as the evening slowly moved toward the most anticipated moment of the reception, the speeches. Glasses clinked gently, chairs shifted, and the soft hum of conversation filled the grand ballroom. The warm golden lights hanging from the crystal chandeliers reflected across the polished floor, making the entire hall glow with celebration. Nearly ***, 300 guests *** sat around beautifully decorated tables, enjoying the elegant dinner and lively atmosphere. At the head table, Emily looked radiant. Her white wedding dress shimmered as she laughed with her bridesmaids, her happiness lighting up the room. Across from her sat Ryan, dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. He leaned back confidently in his chair, occasionally flashing a proud smile toward the guests who congratulated him. Ryan loved attention, and tonight all eyes were on him. At the far end of the ballroom, Daniel Carter sat quietly at a smaller table. He had chosen a seat near the back, not because anyone told him to, but because he preferred it that way. From there, he could see everything. More importantly, he could see Emily. She looked happier than he had ever seen her. Daniel felt a warm sense of peace as he watched her laugh, surrounded by friends and family. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax. Everything had come together perfectly. The decorations were stunning, the food had been praised by nearly every guest, and the atmosphere was filled with joy. Just as he had hoped, then the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced warmly, tapping the microphone, "now we move to the speeches, and first, let's welcome the groom, Ryan." Applause erupted across the hall. Ryan stood smoothly, adjusting his jacket with a confident grin. He kissed Emily on the cheek before walking toward the stage. As he grabbed the microphone, the room grew quiet. Ryan glanced around proudly, clearly enjoying the moment. "Well," he began, chuckling lightly, "what a night." A few guests laughed politely. "I want to start by thanking everyone who came here today to celebrate with us," he continued. "Seeing so many friends and family in one place, it really means a lot." His voice was smooth and charismatic. People nodded, smiling as they listened. Ryan then turned toward Emily, and of course, the most important person tonight, my beautiful wife. Emily blushed as the crowd clapped. Ryan slipped an arm around her shoulders briefly, before turning back to the microphone. "You know," he continued, "weddings like this don't just happen. They take a lot of planning, a lot of effort, and of course, a lot of money." Several guests laughed again. Ryan's parents smiled proudly from their table near the front. "And I really want to thank my family," Ryan added, raising his glass slightly toward them. "They've always believed in doing things the right way, big, beautiful, unforgettable." The guests applauded politely. Daniel listened quietly from the back. So far, everything seemed normal, but then Ryan's tone changed slightly. He chuckled again, shaking his head as if sharing a joke with the room. "And of course," Ryan continued, "Emily's side of the family helped too in their own way." A few people looked around, slightly confused. Ryan paused dramatically. "Let's be honest, though," he said with a smirk. "Without my family stepping in, this wedding might have looked a little different." Soft laughter spread through some tables. Ryan leaned closer to the microphone. "Maybe something small," he added jokingly. "You know, backyard barbecue style." This time the laughter was louder. But not everyone laughed. Some guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Emily's smile faded slightly. Ryan's eyes scanned the room until they landed on Daniel, and then he pointed. Of course, Emily's dad helped a little too, Ryan said casually. 300 heads turned at once. Daniel suddenly found himself the center of attention. Ryan shrugged dramatically. "I mean, he did what he could." A few of Ryan's friends laughed loudly, but let's be real. Ryan added with a grin, "This wedding wouldn't look like this without my family making sure everything was done properly." The room fell silent. The laughter died almost instantly. The insult hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Emily's face turned pale. "Ryan," she whispered quietly, but he didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care. Across the ballroom, Daniel sat perfectly still. Hundreds of eyes were on him. Some guests looked shocked. Others looked embarrassed. A few people shook their heads in disbelief. No one expected a groom to humiliate his own father-in-law, especially on the wedding night. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. Then slowly, calmly, he lifted his glass. He gave Ryan a small, polite smile, and took a sip of water. No anger, no argument, no reaction, just quiet dignity. The silence in the room became painfully uncomfortable. Ryan seemed slightly confused by the calm response. He cleared his throat and quickly wrapped up his speech. "Well, anyway," he muttered awkwardly, "here's to a great future." The applause that followed was weak and uncertain. As Ryan returned to his seat, whispers spread across the ballroom. Emily looked down at the table, clearly hurt and embarrassed. Daniel noticed. His heart ached for her, but his face remained calm. He didn't stand up. He didn't defend himself. He didn't expose the truth. Instead, he simply sat quietly, watching the celebration continue around him. Ryan believed he had just proven something. He thought he had shown the room who truly held power and wealth in the family. But Daniel knew something Ryan didn't. Sometimes the loudest people in the room understand the least. And sometimes the quietest person holds the most powerful story of all. At the back of the ballroom, a tall man who had arrived late stood near the entrance. He had only heard the final part of Ryan's speech, but when his eyes landed on Daniel Carter, his expression changed instantly. Confusion, then recognition, and finally shock. The man's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood up. Several nearby guests turned to look, because the man walking toward the stage now was someone Ryan respected deeply. His powerful uncle, and in just a few moments, the entire wedding reception was about to change forever. For a few moments after Ryan finished his speech, the ballroom was filled with a strange, uneasy silence. The music had started again, but it felt softer now, almost hesitant, as if even the band sensed the tension in the air. Guests leaned toward each other, whispering quietly. Some were shocked. Others were simply uncomfortable. "Humiliating your father-in-law in front of **, 300 guests **, was not something people easily forgot." At the head table, Emily kept her eyes down. her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her napkin. The happiness that had once shined on her face earlier in the evening had faded. Ryan, however, tried to act as if nothing had happened. He laughed with his friends and took a confident sip of champagne, clearly believing his speech had been harmless humor. Across the room, Daniel Carter remained seated at his quiet table near the back. He hadn't moved. His calm expression hadn't changed. If anything, his gentle smile was still there, the same one he always wore when watching his daughter. Anyone who looked at him closely might notice the small sadness in his eyes, but there was no anger, no embarrassment, just quiet dignity. Most people in the room assumed the moment had passed, but they were wrong. Near the entrance of the ballroom stood a tall man in a dark suit who had only arrived minutes earlier. His name was Victor Harrison **. He was Ryan's uncle, a respected businessman known for his sharp mind and powerful connections. Many guests recognized him immediately when he walked in. His reputation carried weight in the business world. Victor had flown in from overseas that morning and barely made it in time for the reception. As he entered the ballroom, he had only caught the last part of Ryan's speech, the part where Ryan pointed across the room and mocked his father-in-law. At first, Victor frowned slightly. Then his eyes followed Ryan's pointing finger across the room, and that's when he saw Daniel. Victor froze. For a moment he simply stared, his brow furrowed in confusion. Then recognition flashed across his face. His eyes widened. "No," he murmured quietly to himself. The glass in his hand lowered slowly. Victor Harrison was not a man easily surprised. In decades of business meetings, negotiations, and corporate battles, he had seen nearly everything. But this moment stunned him, because the quiet man sitting alone at the back of the ballroom was someone he knew very well. Someone he respected deeply. Someone whose name carried far more weight than most people in that room could even imagine. Victor looked back toward the stage where Ryan was laughing with his friends. His expression darkened. Without warning, Victor stood up. His chair scraped loudly across the marble floor. Several nearby guests turned their heads in surprise. Victor didn't notice, or perhaps he didn't care. He walked forward quickly, his long strides cutting across the ballroom with purpose. The closer he got to the stage, the quieter the whispers became. People recognized him. Ryan noticed his uncle approaching and smiled confidently. "Uncle Victor," he called out, "you made it." But Victor didn't smile back. His face was serious. He climbed the small set of steps leading to the stage. "Ryan," he said firmly, extending his hand toward the microphone. Ryan blinked in confusion. "Sure, Uncle Victor." He handed it over, assuming his uncle wanted to give a congratulatory speech. Victor slowly turned toward the crowd. 300 curious faces stared back at him. He then looked down toward Daniel's table. Daniel met his gaze calmly. For a brief moment, the two men simply looked at each other. And then something unexpected happened. Victor Harrison slightly bowed his head. It was subtle, but those close enough to notice were stunned. A man as powerful and respected as Victor Harrison, showing respect to the quiet father sitting in the back. Ryan noticed the gesture too. Confusion crept into his expression. Victor finally raised the microphone. His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. "Ryan," he began slowly, "I have a question for you." Ryan chuckled nervously. "Sure, Uncle." Victor glanced around the room. "Do you know who that man is?" He pointed directly toward Daniel. All eyes turned again. Ryan laughed awkwardly. "Of course I do," he said. "That's my father-in-law." A few people smiled uncertainly. But Victor didn't laugh. Instead, he shook his head slowly. "No," he said firmly. The room grew even quieter. Ryan frowned. "What do you mean?" Victor looked at him with disbelief. "That man," Victor said carefully, "is not just your father-in-law." He paused. Then he continued in a voice loud enough for everyone in the ballroom to hear. "That man is one of the most respected individuals I have ever met." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Ryan's smile faded slightly. Victor stepped closer to the edge of the stage. 22 years ago. He continued, my company was on the verge of bankruptcy. Banks refused to help. Investors walked away. I thought I was going to lose everything. Guests leaned forward in their seats, listening carefully. Victor pointed again toward Daniel, and then that man stepped in. The whispers grew louder. Ryan's eyebrows pulled together in confusion. Victor's voice softened slightly. He helped me when no one else would. He turned his head toward Daniel and gave a small nod of respect. Not because he wanted recognition, Victor continued, but because he believed in helping people. Ryan's face slowly lost its color. Victor looked back at his nephew. And tonight, he said, his voice now heavy with disappointment, you stood here and humiliated him. The words hit the room like thunder. Emily covered her mouth with her hands. Ryan looked stunned. Victor took a slow breath. Then he said something that made the entire ballroom erupt into shocked whispers. Ryan, if not for Daniel Carter, he paused, our family business wouldn't even exist today. Ryan's champagne glass slipped slightly in his trembling hand. Across the room, Daniel remained seated calmly, watching quietly. He still hadn't said a single word. But now the entire room wanted to know the truth about the quiet man, who had just been revealed as far more than anyone ever imagined. The ballroom had never been this quiet. 300 guests sat frozen in their chairs, their eyes shifting back and forth between the stage and the quiet man sitting alone near the back of the room. Moments earlier, the wedding reception had been filled with laughter and music. Now it felt as if the entire hall was holding its breath. Ryan stood beside his uncle, his confident posture completely gone. The smirk he had worn during his speech had vanished, replaced by confusion and a growing sense of fear. He looked toward Daniel, the same man he had mocked just minutes earlier. But now the room was looking at Daniel very differently. Victor Harrison slowly lifted the microphone again. His expression was calm, but the disappointment in his eyes was impossible to hide. Ryan, he said quietly, I'm not sure you understand what you just did. Ryan forced out a nervous laugh. Uncle Victor, I was just joking. It was just a speech. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Victor shook his head slowly. No, he replied, it wasn't a joke. He turned to face the guests. Many of you here know me. Victor continued, you know my company, the success we've built over the past 2 decades. Several people nodded. Victor's reputation in business circles was well known. But what most of you don't know, he said, his voice steady, is that 2 years ago, I was one decision away from losing everything. The room listened in complete silence. My company was collapsing. Victor continued. Banks rejected my requests for loans. Investors refused to take the risk. My employees were preparing for layoffs. He paused. I was desperate. Ryan's parents looked confused. They had never heard this story before. Victor slowly turned and pointed again toward Daniel. And then I met him. All eyes followed his hand. Daniel Carter still sat quietly in his chair, his hands resting calmly on the table. Victor's voice softened slightly. He barely knew me at the time. Victor explained, but he listened to my situation, studied my business plan, and then he did something I will never forget. Victor let the silence stretch for a moment. He helped me. A ripple of whispers moved across the ballroom. Ryan frowned. What do you mean helped? He asked. Victor looked directly at him. He gave me the funding that saved my company. Ryan blinked in disbelief. How much funding? Someone in the audience asked quietly. Victor didn't hesitate. $10 million. Gasps erupted throughout the hall. Even the musicians had stopped playing completely. Ryan's eyes widened. You're serious? He asked. Victor nodded. Yes. Then he added something that made the shock even greater. And he never asked for anything in return. The whispers grew louder. Ryan looked toward Daniel again, trying to process what he was hearing, but Victor wasn't finished. Daniel Carter, he continued, built one of the most successful private investment networks in this region. But he did it quietly. He never chased fame or public recognition. Several guests began murmuring Daniel's name, some suddenly realizing they had heard it before. Victor's voice grew firmer. He helped dozens of companies survive financial disasters, businesses that employ thousands of people today. Ryan's face had turned pale. "You're saying he's rich?" Ryan asked weakly. Victor gave a small, almost amused smile. "Ryan, wealth isn't the most impressive thing about him." He glanced again toward Daniel. "What makes him remarkable is the fact that he never used that wealth to make others feel small." The words hung heavily in the air. Ryan slowly lowered his head. Victor stepped closer to him. "And tonight," he said quietly, "the man who secretly paid for this entire wedding sat silently while you humiliated him." The entire room erupted into shocked murmurs. Emily's head snapped up. "What?" she whispered. Ryan looked like someone had just pulled the ground out from beneath him. "The wedding," he said. Victor nodded. "Yes." He raised the microphone slightly. "The venue, the decorations, the catering, the music, even the honeymoon reservations." Every guest turned toward Daniel again. Daniel Carter paid for all of it. Emily's eyes filled with tears. "Dad," she whispered softly from across the room. Ryan's hands began to shake. "But my parents said—" Victor cut him off gently. "Your parents believed their contributions covered most of the costs," he said, but Daniel quietly handled the rest. Ryan stared at the floor, his mind racing. Everything he had believed about the situation had suddenly collapsed. The man he mocked as small had actually been the most generous person in the room. Victor slowly placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder. "There is something you should learn tonight," he said. Ryan didn't look up. "The quietest person in the room," Victor continued, "is often the one with the most powerful story." Across the hall, Daniel finally stood up. The movement immediately caught everyone's attention. 300 pairs of eyes followed him as he calmly walked toward the stage. His steps were slow and steady. When he reached the front, Victor handed him the microphone. For a moment, Daniel simply looked at the crowd. Then his eyes moved to Emily. His voice was gentle when he finally spoke. "I didn't pay for this wedding to prove anything," he said. Emily wiped tears from her face. "I did it because my daughter deserved a beautiful day." The room grew quiet again. Daniel then turned toward Ryan. There was no anger in his expression, only calm honesty. "Ryan," he said softly, "respect is not measured by money or by who pays for what." Ryan's eyes filled with tears. Daniel paused before finishing. "It's measured by how we treat people when we think they have nothing to offer us." Ryan's shoulders began to shake. In front of 300 silent guests, the confident groom, who had once stood proudly on that stage, now looked like a man realizing the weight of his own mistake. And slowly, Ryan Carter began to cry.